They gave me 7 days. Not a warning, not a conversation, a deadline. 7 days to fill in a swimming hole that had been on my land longer than most of their houses had even existed. 7 days. Or they said they'd start charging me $250 a day until I did. And if I didn't pay, they'd take me to court. What they didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that if I had actually followed their order, they would have been the ones violating state law. And the letter came in a certified envelope. Thick paper, clean print. The kind of formatting that tries to look like authority before you even read the words. I was out in the workshop when the mail truck pulled up. Didn't think anything of it. Expected a usual electric bill, maybe a hardware catalog. Instead, I got something with a return address I recognized immediately. Whispering Creek Estates Homeowners Association. That alone told me everything. I needed to know about how this was going to go. I didn't open it right away. Set it down on the workbench next to a half-finished cedar box I'd been sanding. The smell of sawdust and oil hung in the air. Steady. Familiar. Normal. That letter didn't feel normal. It felt like something that, was about to try and change things. I opened it anyway. Read it once. Then read it again, slower. And a third time just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood something. I hadn't notice of non-compliance. That was the header. Below it, 3 paragraphs of clean, confident language explaining that a non-compliant water feature on my property was in violation of updated HOA community standards. It cited safety risks, liability concerns. Impact on property values. Then, it gave me a timeline. 7 calendar days from receipt of notice to remediate the violation. Their definition of remediation was simple. Drain it, fill it, grade it flat, erase it at the bottom. There was a signature, Linda Carver, HOA board president. And just below that, failure to comply will result in daily fines of $250 and further legal action. I stood there in the workshop for a long time with that paper in my hand. Not angry, not yet, just trying to understand how someone could send something like that and expect it to work. Because here's the part that matters. The part they either didn't know or chose to ignore. My land isn't in there. HOA. It never has been. My grandfather bought these 38 acres in 1965, back when this entire ridge was considered worthless. Too rocky, too uneven, too far from town. Nobody wanted it. So he bought it cheap and spent the next 40 years turning it into something worth having. The subdivision came decades later. Developers bought up everything around us, carved it into identical lots, built houses close enough together that you could hear your neighbor sneeze if the windows were open. Then they added rules. Lots of rules. Paint colors, fence heights, mailbox, designs, the usual, and an HOA to enforce all of it. But my property, it stayed separate, always had, legally distinct. Recorded that way at the county, clear lines, don't overlap, no membership, no obligation, which meant one very simple thing. They didn't have authority over anything on my land. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Because Linda Carver wasn't the kind of person who stopped when she hit a boundary. She was the kind of person who treated boundaries like problems to solve. The first time she came to my property was about 3 years before that letter showed up. Late afternoon, black SUV, parked just outside my gate, like she didn't want to commit to stepping on the land she wasn't sure she controlled yet. She walked up with a clipboard. Of course she did. People like that always have a clipboard. Introduced herself like we were about to have a productive conversation, told me she was the president of the HOA, then she gestured past me, toward the trees, toward the swimming hole, said it was a concern. I remember that word specifically, concern. She talked about safety, about how it was visible from the road, about how it might attract unwanted attention. But then she shifted to property values. Said something about how neighboring homes could be affected. I let her finish. Didn't interrupt, didn't argue. Then I told her, as plainly as I could, I'm not part of your HOA. She smiled, but it changed slightly. Tighten at the corners. I understand, she said, but you were adjacent to the community. That was her angle. ADJ, ACENCY, proximity, SF, being nearby meant being subject to her rules. I nodded. Said, that doesn't give you jurisdiction. That word jurisdiction landed heavier than anything else I'd said. You could see it. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at her clipboard, then back up at me. Well, she said, we'll see about that. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be a one-time conversation. The letters started about a month later. First one was about my fence, to rustic. Second was about my barn, not aesthetically aligned. Third one mentioned my driveway. Gravel instead of paved. Every time I responded the same way. Copied my deed, highlighted the property lines, included a short, polite note. This property is not part of your association. Please update your records. I kept copies of everything. Didn't think I'd need them. Just didn't like throwing things away when they felt unfinished. For a while, that seemed to work. The letters slowed, then stopped. I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't quotes 3 months before the certified letter arrived. Something changed. Quietly, the HOA updated its rules. Didn't notify me. Didn't have to. I wasn't a member. I found out from a neighbor at a gas station. He mentioned something about a new policy on water features. Said the HOA was cracking down. I didn't think much of it at the time. Didn't see how it could apply to me. That was my mistake. Because that new rule, the one I hadn't seen, was the entire basis for the letter, now sitting on my workbench. And that rule said any visible water feature had to meet certified safety standards or be removed 7 days. I folded the letter carefully, set it back down on the bench, and for the first time since I'd read it, I felt something shift. Not panic, not even anger, just a very clear realization. This wasn't going to stop on its own. And if I handled it the wrong way, even once it could turn into something a lot bigger than a letter. So instead of responding right away, I did something else. I went down to the swimming hole. Late afternoon, light coming through the trees at an angle, water completely still, clear enough to see the bottom, the same way it's been for decades. The stone bench my grandfather set at the edge was still there, rough, solid, exactly where he left it. I stood there for a long time, a letter folded in my back pocket, listening to the water, and that's when I realized something that changed how I was going to handle all of this. They thought they were giving me a deadline. What they actually gave me was time. Time to prepare, time to check everything, time to make sure that when this turned into a fight, it would be one they couldn't win. And I had a feeling they were about to make a mistake big enough to end this permanently. The swimming hole wasn't just a hole in the ground, filled with water. That's how they saw it. That's how it looked on paper. A water feature, a liability, something that could be measured, evaluated, and but that's not what it was. My grandfather dug it in the summer of 1972. That was the year after my father came back from overseas. The year everything in the family was trying to settle back into something that felt normal again. The land back then didn't give you anything. It's rock just below the surface, hard clay underneath. Roots dangled through everything like they had something to prove. He didn't have equipment, didn't have a crew, just a shovel, a pickaxe, and the kind of patience you only get from someone who doesn't expect anything in life to come quickly. He started digging in June. Early mornings, late evenings. Avoided the worst of the heat when he could. But most days, he just worked through it. My father used to tell me he'd come home from his job and find him out there, shirt soaked through, hands blistered, still chipping away at the same patch of ground like he had all the time in the world. About 3 weeks in, he hit damp soil. That was the first sign. Most people would have stopped. He didn't, kept digging. Deeper, wider. Followed the moisture until the ground started giving way differently under the shovel. Then one afternoon, water started seeping in. Not much at first, just enough to darken the dirt, but he recognized it for what it was. A spring. He changed the shape of the hole. After that, adjusted it, deepened the center, built up the edges with the rock he'd been pulling out, turned what started as a project into something that worked with the land instead of against it. By the end of August, it had filled, clear, cold, still. He set a flat limestone slab at the edge for sitting, in heavy enough that it took 2 neighbors, and a piece of pipe to roll it into place. That became the spot where people sat, where my father sat, where I sat years later. The first time I got in that water, I was 6 years old. Didn't know how to swim, didn't care. My father stood in the shallow end and told me to jump. I hesitated, looked at how dark the middle got, looked at how I couldn't see the bottom past a certain point. He didn't rush me, just stood there, waited. Then he said something. I still remember word for word. Water's only scary until you understand it. So I jumped, came up, coughing, thrashing, certain I'd made a mistake. Then I felt his hand under my arm. Steady, solid, and after that, I kept going back in. That's how most things worked down there. You learned them by doing, not by being told. Summers revolved around that. Place morning swims, before the heat set in. Evenings, sitting on that limestone bench while the light came through the trees, at an angle that made the water look darker than it was. My father used to fish there. Said the bass liked the cooler water. He'd sit for hours sometimes. Didn't always catch anything. Didn't seem to matter. After he got older. After his knees started giving him trouble. He didn't swim anymore. But he still came down. Still sat on that bench. Still watched the water like it. It was doing something important. When my kids were young, I brought them there the same way he brought me. Didn't make a big deal out of it, just took them down one afternoon and let them see it for themselves. Same reaction I had, same hesitation, same look at the deeper part, and eventually may jump. 3 generations. Same water, same stone, same quiet understanding that some things don't need to change to matter. That's what that letter was asking me to get rid of. Not just dirt and water, not just something visible from the road. All of it. And the thing about people like Linda Carver, they don't see that part. They see surface. They see compliance. They see things in terms of rules and order, and how everything fits into a system that makes sense to them. There's no space in that system for something that exists just because someone decided to build it and never needed permission to keep it. To her. It was an inconsistency. Something outside the plan. To MIT was the only part of this land that had never needed explaining. I went down there the evening after reading the letter. Same pot. I've walked for decades, worn just enough to follow without thinking. The air had that late-day stillness to it, the kind where everything feels like it's settled into place for the night. The water was completely calm, not a ripple, not a sound, except a faint trickle, where the spring fed in along the far edge. I stood at the edge for a while. Didn't sit, didn't move, just looked at it. Tried to imagine what it would look like filled in. Leveled, covered over, like it had never been there. Couldn't do it. It didn't make sense. Not just emotionally, but practically. Because something about that place had always felt intentional. Not in the way my grandfather dug it, but in the way it functioned. Even during heavy rain, the water never overflowed the way you'd expect. It rose, then it leveled, then it settled back down. It handled itself. Always had. I've never questioned it, never had a reason to. But standing there that evening with that letter, still fresh in my mind, I started to think about it differently. Why did it stay so clear? Why didn't it stagnate? Why didn't it cause problems the way they were claiming it would? And more importantly, why had it never been an issue for anyone until now? 50 years, no complaints, no problems, no incidents. Then suddenly it was urgent. That didn't sit right. I walked over to the limestone bench and ran my hand across the surface. Out, still rough, still solid, still exactly where it had always been. You don't keep something like that in place for that long by accident. There was a reason it worked. I just hadn't needed to understand it before. Now, I did. Because if they were going to push this, if they were going to try and force me to destroy something that had been here longer than their entire neighborhood, then I needed more than just it matters to me as a reason to stop them. I needed something they couldn't argue with. Something. But written. Something documented. Something that didn't care about opinions or HOA rules or what looked better from the road. Something that existed whether they acknowledged it or not. I stood there a while longer, watching the water, listening to that steady, quiet sound where the spring fed in. And the more I paid attention, the more it became obvious. This wasn't just a hole filled with water. It was part of something bigger. I just hadn't traced it yet. By the time I walked back up to the house, the light was almost gone. The letter was still sitting where I'd left it in the workshop. 7 days. That's what they thought they gave me. What they actually did was give me a reason to start asking questions I'd never needed to ask before. And once I started digging into those answers, things were going to change. Not just for me, for them too. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I didn't respond to the letter. That's what they were expecting. A reaction, an argument, maybe even compliance. I did none of those things. Instead, I started paying attention. Because when someone gives you a deadline that aggressive, that confident, that absoluted, usually means one of two things. They either know they're right, or they're hoping you won't take the time to prove they're wrong. And something about that letter, the wording, the urgency, the tone felt more like the second. By mid-morning, I got my first call, unknown number. I let it ring once. Twice, then picked up. Mr. Harper? Her voice was exactly the same as I remembered. Polite, measured, carefully controlled.
Yes.
This is Linda Carver, president of the Whispering Creek Estates HOA. I just wanted to confirm you received our notice. Not if I received it. Confirmed. I did a pause, just long enough to suggest she expected more. And do you intend to comply within the 7-day period? Straight to it, no small talk. No attempt to soften the question. I looked out the workshop window toward the tree line, toward where I knew the swimming hole sat, still and quiet like it always had been. I'm reviewing it, I said. Another pause. This one slightly shorter. I would strongly advise you not to delay, she said. The board is prepared to move forward with enforcement if necessary. There it was again. Confidence. Assumption. Double quotes. Noted. I said. And that was it. She waited a second, maybe expecting resistance. Didn't get it very well. She said, and hung up. That call told me something important. She thought pressure would work, which meant she didn't think her position was strong enough to stand without it. That same afternoon, I noticed something else. A car parked along the county road. Not unusual by itself. People pull over all the time, take calls, check directions. But this one stayed, longer than normal. And when I stepped out toward the driveway, I saw exactly what they were doing. Photos. Long lens. Pointed straight through the trees, at the swimming hole. They weren't even trying to hide it. I didn't wave, didn't approach, just stood there long enough for them to notice me. They lowered the camera. Sat for a second. Then drove off. That was new. The letters had been one thing, annoying, but distant. This was different. This meant they were building something, a case, a file, something they could point to and say, this is why we acted. Which meant I needed to start doing the same. That evening, I pulled out every piece of paper I'd ever received from them. Fence notice. Barn complaint. Driveway issue. All of it. Spread across the kitchen table. Looked at the dates, the wording, the progression. It wasn't random. It was escalation. Each letter slightly more assertive than the last. Each one testing how far they could push. before getting resistance. And now, dash this. 7 days. I started a new folder, .manila, nothing special. But this one was different from the others. I wrote one word, on the front, H, and I put everything inside. Every letter, every envelope, even the certified mail receipt, because at that point, I knew this wasn't going to end with a single response. It was going to build. The next move came faster than I expected. 2 days later, another letter arrived. Not certified this time. Just standard. Mail. Different tone. Same message. This one referenced community concerns. Mentioned increased risk exposure. We used phrases like potential liability event. It wasn't written for me. It was written for a record. Something they could later say, see? We warned him. I read it once. Added it to the folder, and set it aside. Then I went down to the swimming hole again. Late afternoon. Same still water. Same quiet. But now I was looking at it differently. Not just as something personal. As something they were trying to classify. Define. Control. And the more I thought about it, the less their argument made sense. If it was such a serious risk, why now? Why after decades of nothing? Why after 3 years of minor complaints about fences and barns? Why jump straight to a 7-day deadline? That kind of escalation doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from something changing. I just didn't know what yet. On the 3rd day I found out. My neighbor, Tom Wilkes, flagged me down while I was coming back from town. Retired guy. Been living on the edge of that subdivision since it was built. That knows more about what goes on there than most of the people actually inside it. You hear what they passed? He asked. No. We shook his head, half amused. Half amused, half annoyed. New HOA rule. Water features. Anything visible from the road has to meet some state safety standard now. Pools, ponds, whatever. There it was. They're going after you with it, he added. I leaned back against the truck door for a second. Let that settle. Did they vote on it? I asked. Tom shrugged. Supposedly. Supposedly. That word did more work than anything else, he said. Because HOAs don't just make rules. They have procedures, votes, thresholds, documentation, .org. At least they're supposed to. Appreciate it, I said. Tom nodded. Started to walk off. Then turned back. They've been talking about your place at meetings, he said. More than anything else. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about, safety. This was about control. And they had just created a rule to justify going after. Something they'd already decided they didn't like. I drove home slower than usual. Not distracted. Focused. Because now the situation looked different. Before, it was just pressure. Now it was strategy. And strategy can be picked apart. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table again. Folder open. Letters spread out. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting. I was analyzing. What rule were they actually using? When was it passed? Who approved it? Did it even apply outside their subdivision? Those were the questions that mattered. Because if the answer to any of them was wrong, even slightly, then everything they were doing started to fall apart. And something told me they hadn't checked as carefully as they should have. Day 4 ended with another drive past the road. Another slow car. Another look through the trees. They were watching, documenting, waiting. Let them. Because while they were building their case, based on assumptions, I was about to start building mine based on facts. And facts don't care how confident you sound in a letter. They either hold up or they don't. And I had a feeling theirs wouldn't. On the 5th day, I went to the county clerk's office. Not because I was panicking. Because I was done guessing. There's a difference between thinking you're right and knowing you are. Up until that point, I had the first one. What I needed now was the second. The clerk's office sits in an old brick building just off the main road. Same place it's always been. Inside. It smells like paper and time. Rows of records. Deeds. Maps. Filings. They go back further than most people realize. The kind of place where answers exist if you're willing to look for them. The woman behind the counter recognized me. Didn't ask questions. Just nodded when I told her what I needed. My property deed, I said. And the subdivision records for Whispering Creek Estates. She disappeared into the back for a few minutes. Came back with a stack of documents and a flat tube. Plat maps in here, she said, tapping the tube. That was the important part. I took everything to one of the long tables by the window. Spread it out carefully. Didn't rush. Because details matter in places like that. I started with my deed. Read it line by line. Same description. I'd seen before. Same boundaries. Same legal identifiers. Nothing surprising then. I moved on to the subdivision records. That's where things started to get interesting. The plat map was large, wider than the table. I had to unroll it slowly. Flatten the corners with whatever I could find nearby. And there it was. Clear as anything. That subdivision. All the lots. All the roads. All neatly defined. And just outside of it, my property separate. Outlined in a different line style. No overlap. No inclusion. The boundary between them wasn't vague. It wasn't debatable. It was exact. I traced it with my finger. followed it along the edge closest to the road, then toward the section where the swimming hole sat. Still outside, still clearly not part of anything they controlled. That alone should have been enough. But I kept going, because something about this whole situation felt like it had another layer, something they either missed or didn't think I'd look for. I started going through the HOA documents. Next, articles of incorporation, bylaws, recorded amendments. That's where the timeline started to form. Original, rules, initial filings, then more recent updates. And finally, the one I was looking for. The water feature amendment. I read it slowly, carefully, language. About visibility, safety compliance, state certification, all the things they'd cited in the letter. But what mattered wasn't just what it said, it was how it got there. Because HOA rules don't exist just because someone writes them down. They have to be adopted properly. Votes, thresholds, member approval. So I flipped back to the bylaws, looked for the section on amendments. There it was. Clear requirement. Any rule change required a two-thirds majority vote of the full membership, not the board. The membership. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because boards can propose, they can't just decide. So I went back to the amendment, looked for the record of that vote. There should have been documentation. Meeting minutes, a recorded tally. Something. There wasn't. I checked. Again, slower this time. Nothing. No vote record, no certification, no attached minutes showing approval. Just the amendment itself. Filed, stamped. Existing. Without proof, it had been legally adopted. I sat back in the chair for a second. Let that sink in. Because if that rule wasn't properly approved, then it wasn't enforceable, which meant their entire case, the letter. The deadline? The fines was built on something that might not legally exist. That was the first crack. But it wasn't the only one. I went back to the plat map. This time. I looked closer at the area around the swimming hole, not just the boundary, the terrain. There was a marking I hadn't paid attention to before, a line running through part of the subdivision's common area. Curved, subtle, easy to overlook, if you weren't looking for it. I leaned in, read the notation beside it. Drainage easement, but got my attention. I followed it with my finger, from the higher ground in the subdivision, down toward the edge of my property, and then right through the area where the swimming hole sat. I stopped there, looked again, made sure I wasn't misreading it. I wasn't. The natural drainage path from part of their subdivision ran directly into my land, into that spring-fed area, into the swimming hole. That explains why the water never overflowed, why it stayed balanced, why it handled heavy rain without turning into a problem. It wasn't just a hole, it was part of a drainage system. Not one I built, not one my grandfather planned out on paper, but one that existed and had been recognized officially when the subdivision was approved. I went back to the subdivision documents, started looking for anything related to drainage. STORMWATER. Environmental requirements. And then I found it, a condition tied to the original approval. The developer had agreed to maintain natural drainage patterns, not disrupt them, not block them, and specifically to account for existing water flow features in the surrounding land, which meant one very important thing. That swimming hole, the one they were demanding I fill, was part of the system their entire neighborhood depended on to manage water. I sat there for a long time after that, not moving, not flipping pages, just thinking. Because now the situation had shifted. This wasn't just about them lacking authority. This was about them demanding something that could create a bigger problem. If I filled that hole, if I blocked that drainage, then all that water had to go somewhere else. And when it did, it wouldn't be my problem alone. It would be theirs. Legally, practically, all of it. I rolled the plat map back up carefully, stacked the documents, took a deep breath. Then I went back to the counter. I'll need copies of these, I said. The clerk nodded. DID and sing. Quotes TS why she'd probably seen enough situations like this to know exactly what was happening. When I walked out of that building, the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, clearer. Because now I wasn't dealing with assumptions. I had documents, records, proof, and more importantly, had a direction. They thought they had 7 days to force me into compliance. What they actually did was give me enough time to find the one thing they never checked. And once that came into play, everything they'd built this on was going to start coming apart. I didn't respond to them right away. Not after the clerk's office. Not after the plat map. Not even after finding the drainage easement. Because once you realize the other side has made a mistake, don't rush in and point it out. You let them keep moving. You let them commit to it. You let them build their entire position on something that won't hold. Then, when it matters, you show them exactly where it breaks. Day 6 came and went without a word from me. No letter, no call, no acknowledgement. They know to stop because early the next morning, day 7, Linda showed up in person. Same SUV, same clipboard, different tone. She didn't stop at the gate this time. Walked right up to the house, like the deadline. Gave her permission. I stepped out onto the porch before she could knock. You're out of time, she said. No greeting. No pretense. Just the statement. I looked at her for a second, not responding right away, because this was the moment she'd been building toward. The moment she expected. Resistance, maybe even compliance at the last second. I received your letter, I said. Her jaw tightened slightly. And, she asked, I've been reviewing it. That wasn't what she wanted to hear. She adjusted her grip on the clipboard, shifted her weight slightly. The compliance period has ended, she said. At this point, the board is prepared to begin enforcement procedures, which are, I asked, daily fines, legal escalation if necessary. She said it clean, practiced, like she'd already said it to someone else. That told me something. This wasn't the first time she'd done this. Just the first time it wasn't going to work. See, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. She was waiting for something. Agreement. Pushback. Anything that moved this forward. Instead, I asked a question. When was the amendment passed? She blinked once. Just slightly. The board approved it 3 months ago. The board? I repeated. Yes, I nodded slowly. In the membership. That's where it shifted. Just a fraction, but enough. The board has authority to enact rules in the interest of the community, she said. That wasn't an answer. It was a deflection. I didn't ask about authority, I said. I asked if the membership voted on it. Another pause. This one longer. Proper procedures were followed, she said. That was the second deflection, which meant she either didn't know or didn't want to say. Neither one helped her. I let that sit for a second. Didn't press further, because I already had what I needed from that exchange. She didn't have a clean answer, and if she didn't have it, there was a good chance it didn't exist. We'll be issuing the first fine today, she said, shifting back to her script. Go ahead, I said. That caught her off guard, just enough to show. You understand that will continue daily, she said. I understand, I replied. Another pause. This one felt different, less controlled, because this wasn't how this was supposed to go. People don't usually agree to fines. They push back. They argue. They try to negotiate. I wasn't doing any of that, and that made her uncertain. Very well, she said finally. Then she turned and walked back to her SUV. Didn't say anything else. Didn't try to extend the conversation, because at that point she thought she'd already won. And that was her mistake. The first fine notice showed up that afternoon. Hand delivered this time. Left in the mailbox like they wanted to make sure I saw it immediately. Learned 250. Day 1 of non-compliance. I added it to the folder. Didn't respond. Day 2. Another notice. Another $250. Day 3. Same thing. They were consistent. I'll give them that. By the end of the week, they'd stacked up $1,000 in fines, and still, no response from me. That silence started to work against them, because pressure only works when the other side reacts. Without a reaction, it starts to feel uncertain. And uncertainty leads to escalation. That came in the form of a letter from their attorney. Different letterhead, different tone. Same underlying assumption. It referenced the HOA's authority, cited compliance obligations, suggested that failure to resolve the issue could result in formal legal action, but buried in the middle, if it was something interesting, a mention of potential structural concerns related to unregulated water impoundment. That wording was doing a lot of work, because it was vague enough to sound serious, without actually stating anything specific, which usually means one thing. They're trying to find an angle that fits, not one that already does. I read the letter twice, then set it aside, because at that point the pattern was clear. They weren't operating from certainty. They were searching, trying. Different approaches, seeing what would stick. That's when I made my next move. Not toward them, toward the county. Because if they were going to start throwing around claims about safety, liability, and structural concerns, then I wanted someone with actual authority to look at it. Not an HOA, not their attorney. Someone who dealt with this kind of thing for real. I made the call the next morning. Requested an inspection. Kept it simple. Didn't mention the HOA. Didn't frame it as a dispute. Just asked for an evaluation of a spring-fed water feature on private property. They scheduled it for 2 days later, when the inspector showed up. He wasn't what most people expect. No urgency, no assumptions, just a clipboard, a testing kit, and the kind of calm that comes from doing the same job long enough to recognize when something's actually a problem and when it isn't. We walked down to the swimming hole together. Same path. Same quiet. He didn't say much at first. Just observed. Checked the water. Measured depth. Looked at the inflow, the outflow. Took notes, worked methodically. After about 20 minutes, he closed his clipboard, looked out across the water for a second. Spring-fed, he asked. Yes, he nodded. Water's clean, he said. No stagnation, no buildup. Flow's steady. That matched what I already knew, but hearing it from someone official, that mattered. What about classification? I asked. He looked at me. Private use, he said. Yes. He nodded again. Then it's not regulated as a public facility, he said. Different category entirely. That was the confirmation I needed. Not opinion, not interpretation, classification, the kind that holds up when someone tries to challenge it. He finished up a few minutes later, left me with a copy of the inspection summary. No violations, no action required. I stood there after he left, holding that paper, listening to the water, because now everything had shifted. The HOA had issued fines, sent legal threats, filed complaints, all based on the idea that this was a problem, and now I had official documentation saying it wasn't. That alone was enough to weaken their position, but it wasn't the biggest issue. They had not even close, because while they were focusing on enforcement, they still hadn't realized the one thing that mattered most. The thing I found in the clerk's office, the thing tied to that drainage easement, the thing that meant if this went any further, they weren't just wrong, they were exposed. They just hadn't stepped into it yet, but they were getting closer.